It was a beautiful sunny day in the heart of the city, and the park was bustling with life. Families gathered on blankets for picnics, children laughed and played, and friends strolled along the paths, soaking in the warmth and serenity of the afternoon. It was a scene of peace and joy, a sanctuary from the city's constant buzz. Amid this lively atmosphere stood Officer Roberts, a middle-aged, stern-faced police officer with a hard gaze and an unwavering posture. He was known around the precinct as a no-nonsense cop, one who believed in law and order and who didn't tolerate nonsense, as he often put it. To most people, the park was a place to relax, a haven in the city. But to Officer Roberts, it was a place that required constant vigilance, especially when it came to people who, in his eyes, didn't quite seem to belong. As he scanned the park, his gaze eventually landed on a lone figure sitting on a bench. A well-dressed black man sat there, poised and calm, his suit tailored perfectly, a briefcase resting by his side. The man, later known to the audience as Mr. Johnson, occasionally glanced at his watch, as if waiting for someone. But he exuded a sense of calm confidence that didn't seem fitting for a casual parkgoer. His back was straight, his expression serene, and there was an unmistakable air of self-assuredness about him. To any other observer, Mr. Johnson might have appeared like a professional simply enjoying a quiet moment or preparing for an upcoming meeting. But to Officer Roberts, the man's quiet confidence read as arrogance, and he didn't like it one bit. In his mind, this man's demeanor was more than calmness. It was defiance, a refusal to conform to the unspoken rules Officer Roberts felt he was responsible for enforcing. Muttering to himself, Officer Roberts felt his suspicion grow. Who does he think he is, sitting here like he owns the place? He grumbled under his breath, his gaze hardening. Adjusting his belt, Roberts straightened up and started toward the man with a purpose, determined to set things straight. Each step he took was deliberate and heavy, his expression a mix of authority and disdain. The tension in the air was palpable, each footstep building suspense. Mr. Johnson noticed Officer Roberts approaching and looked up, his expression calm and unflinching. He didn't seem startled or intimidated. Instead, he met the officer's gaze with a polite, unwavering look. This composed reaction only served to irk Officer Roberts further, as though the man's calm demeanor was some form of silent defiance. Stopping just in front of Mr. Johnson, Officer Roberts cast his shadow over him, standing tall and unyielding. With a tone that was both stern and accusatory, he spoke. "Sir, may I ask what you're doing here?" There was no warmth in his voice, only a cold, assessing edge. Mr. Johnson looked up at him, a polite smile appearing on his face. "Just waiting for someone. Is there a problem, officer?" he replied, his voice calm and respectful. But this calm response only fueled the officer's suspicions. In his mind, the man's collected demeanor wasn't just confidence, it was arrogance, a refusal to acknowledge his authority. "Depends," Officer Roberts replied curtly. "Do you have any ID on you?" Mr. Johnson's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been resignation, as if he was all too familiar with this type of encounter. With measured, deliberate movements, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ID, handing it over without a word. Officer Roberts took the ID, scrutinizing it with an intensity that seemed unnecessary, as though he expected to find something hidden in plain sight. His gaze lingered on the ID longer than necessary before he handed it back, his expression unchanged. "Mind telling me what business you have here?" he asked, his tone sharp and condescending, as if he were speaking to a misbehaving child. Mr. Johnson's polite smile faded slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I'm here for a meeting. It's a public park, after all," he said, his tone measured, almost as if he were trying to remind the officer of something he'd forgotten. But his words only seemed to irritate Officer Roberts further. In his mind, this man's polite refusal to be intimidated was a form of resistance. The officer took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You know," he said, his words laced with disdain. "People like you have a tendency to hang around places where they don't belong. Makes folks around here uncomfortable." Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow, his face showing a hint of disbelief, though he remained calm. "People like me," he echoed softly, his voice steady. "Officer, I'm just waiting in a public park. I don't see how that could make anyone uncomfortable." The officer scoffed, dismissing his words. "Watch the tone," he snapped. "I'm the one asking questions here." Mr. Johnson took a slow breath, clearly recognizing the officer's hostility, but choosing not to escalate the situation. Around them, a few parkgoers had started to notice the exchange, some exchanging glances, others pulling out their phones to record the interaction. But the growing attention did nothing to deter Officer Roberts, who was determined to show this man his place. The tension continued to build, each word exchanged between them charged with an underlying tension. The officer felt his control slipping, and he didn't like it. He raised his voice, his frustration bleeding into his words. "All right, enough of this attitude," he said, his tone harsh. "You're resisting my request, and that's grounds for further action." Mr. Johnson remained composed, though a hint of frustration crossed his face. "Officer, I'm not resisting anything," he said, his tone still respectful. "I'm here like everyone else." But to Roberts, this response was defiance, a challenge to his authority. Without hesitation, he reached for his handcuffs. "Stand up," he commanded, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for failing to comply." Mr. Johnson looked around, realizing the situation had escalated, yet he stayed calm. "Is this really necessary, officer?" he asked, his tone steady, but Roberts sneered. "Maybe next time you'll learn to follow instructions." With that, he yanked Mr. Johnson to his feet, snapping the cuffs onto his wrists with an unnecessary amount of force. A few people gasped, and whispers spread through the crowd, some visibly uncomfortable, others recording on their phones, capturing every second. As Officer Roberts led Mr. Johnson toward his patrol car, he couldn't resist adding snide remarks, each one dripping with condescension. "You probably thought you could just sit here, acting like you're better than everyone else," he sneered. Mr. Johnson didn't respond, his silence dignified, even as the officer attempted to belittle him. The contrast between Roberts's aggression and Mr. Johnson's quiet composure was stark, and the crowd watching felt the tension. Inside the patrol car, Mr. Johnson sat quietly, his gaze fixed ahead. Meanwhile, Roberts returned to his desk to fill out the paperwork, throwing glances back at the patrol car as if expecting Mr. Johnson to break. But he remained composed, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. This silence only served to irritate Roberts more. "Thinks he's better than everyone else," he muttered to himself as he scrawled notes on the arrest report. Just then, a second officer, Miller, arrived, having responded to the incident report. Miller took one look at the man in the back of the patrol car and froze, his face going pale as he recognized him. "Roberts, that's Mr. Johnson," Miller stammered, his face full of disbelief. Roberts looked up, annoyed. "Yeah, and?" "He was loitering and being uncooperative," he replied dismissively. But Miller shook his head, his voice now urgent. "Roberts, you do know who that is, right? That's Special Agent Johnson, FBI." At that moment, the smug confidence that Roberts had felt evaporated, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. His jaw dropped as he looked from Miller to the patrol car, where Mr. Johnson sat, his calm gaze directed squarely at Roberts. The full weight of his mistake hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd not only arrested an innocent man, but a high-ranking federal agent, all based on his own assumptions. Desperate to salvage the situation, Roberts hurried toward the patrol car, fumbling for words. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't realize I was just following procedure," he stammered, his voice shaky. But Mr. Johnson's gaze remained steady, his expression unyielding. Mr. Johnson looked him straight in the eye, his voice calm but firm. Procedure or assumptions? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as Robert stood there, speechless, his face flushed with shame. Desperate, he tried to explain. "Look, I'm sorry, I thought—" But Mr. Johnson didn't let him finish. "That was exactly the problem," he said, his tone resolute. "You thought you knew everything about me from one glance." Robert stood there, feeling utterly exposed, the weight of his mistake settling on him with crushing force. His mind raced, frantically searching for some way to salvage the situation, to undo the damage that had already been done. He had crossed a line. No, he had bulldozed right over it, all because he thought he could judge a man by his appearance, by a single look. The realization hit him hard, leaving him feeling vulnerable and stripped of the authority he had clung to so tightly just moments before. Mr. Johnson's gaze hadn't wavered. He looked at Roberts with a calm, composed expression, one that seemed to see right through him. It wasn't a look of anger or contempt, but of profound disappointment, as if Mr. Johnson had seen this happen one too many times before. That disappointment stung, cutting deeper than any reprimand or punishment. The other officer, Miller, shifted uncomfortably beside them, clearly uneasy with the entire scene. He had seen Roberts act with excessive force and prejudice before, but this was something different. The fact that Mr. Johnson was an FBI agent, a high-ranking figure in law enforcement, wondering how his colleague could have been so blind, so reckless. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a glaring example of the biases that plagued their department and the attitudes that seemed to go unchallenged. And now, in this one moment, all of it was laid bare for everyone to see. Roberts took a step back, his hands trembling as he fumbled for words. "Mr. Johnson, I didn't know, I thought—" he stammered. But even as he spoke, he knew his words were empty. What could he possibly say to make this right? What excuse could justify his actions? His voice trailed off, the apology dying on his lips. Mr. Johnson watched him silently for a long moment, as if weighing his response. Finally, in a calm, measured tone, he spoke. "And what exactly did you think, Officer Roberts?" His voice was steady, each word deliberate, forcing Roberts to confront his own assumptions head-on. There was no anger, no raised voice, just a quiet insistence that Roberts face the truth of what he'd done. Roberts felt his face flush, shame flooding through him as he realized there was no defense, no justification. He had looked at this man, seen his skin color, his demeanor, and made a snap judgment. He had assumed guilt, assumed inferiority, and had acted on those assumptions without a second thought. I thought—" he began again, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He stopped, swallowing hard as he looked away, unable to meet Mr. Johnson's steady gaze. For the first time in his career, he felt truly small, his authority stripped away, his self-impunity shattered. A few people in the crowd murmured, their voices low but unmistakably critical. They had seen the whole thing unfold, the initial confrontation, the arrest, the shocking revelation of Mr. Johnson's identity. Some shook their heads in disapproval, while others whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of disbelief and outrage. Roberts could feel their judgment, their silent condemnation, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He had been so certain, so sure of his authority, and now he found himself exposed, his actions laid bare for all to see. After a tense silence, Mr. Johnson spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Roberts, do you know how many times I've experienced this? How many times I've been judged, not by my actions, but by assumptions? Do you have any idea what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that kind of prejudice?" His words were measured, his words shifted uncomfortably. his face pale as he tried to process what he was hearing. He had never thought about it, never considered what it might feel like to live with that kind of scrutiny, that constant suspicion. In his mind, he was just doing his job, but now, faced with the reality of his actions, he saw how shallow that justification truly was. Mr. Johnson continued, his voice unwavering. "The irony, officer, is that I dedicated my life to upholding the same laws you claim to protect. I serve the same country, wear a similar badge. And yet, here I am, judged by you, not for who I am, but for what you assumed me to be." His gaze was piercing, filled with a depth of experience and understanding that Roberts could hardly comprehend. It was as if Mr. Johnson's words were peeling away the layers of Roberts's self-perception, exposing the flaws and biases he had never been forced to confront before. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say to that? How could he, in his limited experience, possibly understand what Mr. Johnson had endured? He felt a wave of regret wash over him, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. In that moment, he wanted nothing more than to go back, to undo what he had done, to make different choices. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and no amount of regret could change that. The silence hung heavy between them, filled with the weight of unspoken words and missed opportunities. Finally, Roberts managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry," he said, the words falling flat, inadequate in the face of his actions. Mr. Johnson regarded him with a quiet dignity, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded, acknowledging the apology, but offering no forgiveness. This wasn't a matter that could be smoothed over with a few words. It was a matter of systemic injustice, of a lifetime of prejudice and discrimination. And Roberts knew, deep down, that a simple apology would never be enough to make up for that. As Mr. Johnson turned to leave, Roberts felt a pang of desperation. He didn't want this to be the end of it. He needed, a chance to make things right. "Mr. Johnson," he called after him, his voice filled with a raw vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show before. Mr. Johnson paused, turning back to look at him, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. I want to understand," Roberts said, his voice breaking slightly. I want to learn how to be better, how to see people as they are, not as I assume them to be." For a moment, Mr. Johnson studied him, his expression thoughtful. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe hope? Maybe skepticism. Finally, he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and said, "Then start by listening, Officer Roberts. Start by questioning your assumptions, by recognizing that the world is more complex than the labels you place on it." His voice was gentle, but the words carried a weight of wisdom and experience that Roberts felt deeply. It was both a challenge and an invitation, a chance for redemption, if he was willing to do the work. The scene shifts to Roberts in his own home later that night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, his head in his hands as he grapples with everything that had happened. The weight of the day's events presses down on him, forcing him to confront truths he had long ignored. He thinks about Mr. Johnson's words, the quiet dignity with which he had endured the injustice, the grace with which he had extended a chance for change. Roberts realizes that he has been given an opportunity, a rare, precious chance to grow, to break free from the biases that had shaped his life and his career. As he sits there, the camera pans to the room around him, the silence filled with the gravity of introspection. Roberts pulls out a notebook and begins to write, his thoughts raw and unfiltered. "Today, I met a man who showed me what true strength looks like," he writes. "He showed me that respect isn't something given because of a title or a uniform. It's something earned through understanding, through compassion." His hand trembles as he writes, each word a step toward a new understanding, a new way of seeing the world. The scene fades out as Roberts sits alone, the dim light casting shadows that reflect the inner turmoil and transformation taking place within him. The silence speaks volumes, a testament to the profound impact of the day's events. In that quiet moment, Roberts knows that his life has changed forever, that he has been given a rare glimpse into a reality he had long ignored. And with that knowledge comes a responsibility, a call to action that he can no longer deny. The following day, Officer Roberts returned to the precinct, but he felt different. The world around him seemed to have shifted, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow an outsider in his own life. As he walked through the halls, the familiar sights and sounds felt distant, almost foreign. Conversations between colleagues, which he once joined without a second thought, now sounded hollow, tinged with an undertone of cynicism that he had never noticed before. He felt like he was seeing everything through new eyes, and he wasn't entirely sure he liked what he saw. In the locker room, he overheard a few officers joking about getting tough with certain people in certain neighborhoods. It was the kind of banter he had always brushed off, the sort of dark humor that many officers use to cope with the pressures of the job. But today, it didn't sit right with him. He felt a pang of guilt, remembering how he himself had laughed at similar jokes in the past, how he'd participated in conversations that now struck him as deeply wrong. He glanced around the room, wondering if any of his colleagues felt the same discomfort, if anyone else had ever questioned the things they said, the way they treated people. But as he looked at their faces, he saw nothing but the same hardened expressions, the same sense of camaraderie built on an us versus them mentality. For a moment, he considered speaking up, saying something to challenge the narrative that had become so ingrained in their culture. But the words caught in his throat, and he found himself silenced by the weight of his own complicity. How could he, who had only just begun to see the world differently, hope to change the minds of men who had spent years reinforcing each other's biases? The realization hit him hard. Change wouldn't come easy. It would be a battle, not only with his colleagues, but with himself. He would have to confront parts of himself that he had long ignored, parts that had been shaped by years of prejudice and assumptions. Later that day, Roberts was assigned to a neighborhood he hadn't patrolled in years, a predominantly black area where tensions between the community and the police were high. He remembered the last time he'd been assigned here, how he'd felt on edge, viewing every resident with suspicion, every street corner as a potential threat. But today, he felt something different, a sense of responsibility, a desire to make things right, if only in small ways. He drove slowly through the neighborhood, observing the people around him, not as potential suspects, but as individuals with lives, families, and struggles of their own. As he stopped at a red light, he noticed a group of young men gathered on the corner, laughing and chatting. In the past, he would have seen them as a potential problem, would have watched them with suspicion, waiting for any sign of trouble. But today, he forced himself to look deeper, to see them not as a threat, but as young men enjoying a moment of camaraderie. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of Mr. Johnson's words, of the need to question his assumptions, to see people for who they were rather than who he expected them to be. Just then, his radio crackled to life, and he was dispatched to a nearby park for a disturbance involving a group of teenagers. As he drove to the location, he felt a familiar knot of tension form in his stomach. But he pushed it down, reminding himself to approach the situation with an open mind, to treat each person with the respect they deserved. When he arrived, he saw a group of teenagers gathered around a basketball court, arguing over a game. The scene was loud but harmless, a simple disagreement blown out of proportion. He approached the group, his posture relaxed, his tone calm. "Hey guys, what's going on here?" he asked, his voice devoid of the usual authority he might have projected. The teenagers looked at him, surprised by his friendly tone. One of them, a young man with a determined expression, stepped forward. "We're just playing ball, officer. Just a little disagreement. Nothing serious," he said. his voice defensive but respectful. Roberts nodded, sensing the young man's distrust, the guarded look in his eyes. It was a look he recognized, one he had seen in Mr. Johnson's eyes. A look born from a lifetime of being judged, of having to prove oneself in the face of prejudice. Rather than escalate the situation, Roberts smiled and said, "All right, I get it. Just try to keep it down, all right? No harm done." He turned to leave, but before he could, the young man called after him, "Thanks, officer." For not, jumping to conclusions. There was a moment of silence, and then Roberts nodded, feeling a sense of pride and humility wash over him. This was a small step. But it was a small step. But it was a step in the right direction. Over the next few months, Roberts continued to attend community events, participating in discussions, listening to people's stories, and working to build bridges between the police and the neighborhoods he served. He volunteered for outreach programs, spending time with youth groups, mentoring young men and women who had once viewed the police with fear and distrust. Slowly, he began to see a shift, not just in himself, but in the way the community responded to him. He was no longer seen as just another cop, but as someone who genuinely cared, who was willing to listen, to learn, and to stand alongside them. One evening, he sat alone in his living room, scrolling through news stories about police violence, about cases that had made headlines, each one a stark reminder of the damage that unchecked power could inflict. He read about families torn apart, lives destroyed, and he felt a deep sense of shame, not only for his own actions, but for the role he had played in a system that perpetuated such suffering. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his badge, not as a symbol of authority, but as a symbol of authority, but as a symbol of responsibility. A responsibility to protect, to serve, and to uphold justice in its truest sense. As he sat there, lost in thought, he received a message from Mr. Johnson. It was brief, just a few lines, but it carried a powerful message. "Officer Roberts, change is hard, but it's possible. It starts with acknowledging the truth, with questioning the things we've been taught. If you're willing, there's a community forum next week. I'd like you to attend, to listen, and to learn. You're welcome there." The invitation was unexpected, but Roberts felt a surge of gratitude and a sense of purpose. This was a chance, a real chance, to make amends, to begin the journey of becoming the man he wanted to be. The day of the forum arrived, and Roberts found himself standing outside a small community center, feeling both nervous and hopeful. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he walked through the doors and into the crowded room. The air was thick with anticipation, filled with people from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, all gathered to discuss the issues that had plagued their community for too long. As he took a seat in the back, he felt the weight of their gazes, the distrust in their eyes, but he also felt a sense of hope, a willingness to give him a chance. Mr. Johnson was there, standing at the front of the room, his presence commanding but warm. He greeted Roberts with a nod, a silent acknowledgement of the journey that had brought him here. Throughout the forum, Roberts listened intently as people shared their stories, their pain, their frustration. He heard from mothers who had lost sons, from young men who had been harassed, from community leaders who had fought tirelessly for justice. Each story was a testament to the strength and resilience of a community that had endured so much, and each one left an indelible mark on Roberts's heart. As the forum drew to a close, Mr. Johnson invited Roberts to speak. The room fell silent as he stood, feeling the weight of 100 expectant eyes on him. Taking a deep breath, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I came here today because I realized I have a lot to learn. I've made mistakes, and I'm here to listen, to understand, and to do better." His words were met with nods, with murmurs of approval, and for the first time he felt a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. In that moment, Roberts knew that his journey was only beginning. He had a long road ahead of him, filled with challenges and difficult truths. But he was ready. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was on the right path, not as a man of authority, but as a man of integrity, committed to justice in its truest form. In the days that followed the community forum, Officer Roberts found himself with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer saw himself as simply a man in a uniform, someone tasked with enforcing the law. Instead, he felt the profound responsibility of being a protector, an advocate, and an ally. He was committed to earning back the trust of the community, one action at a time. Each day on the job became an opportunity to reflect, to question, and to choose a different path from the one he had walked before. Word of his attendance at the forum spread through the department, and it wasn't long before some of his colleagues began to notice changes in his demeanor. Conversations that he would once have joined, filled with cynical jokes and dismissive remarks about the communities they served, no longer felt right to him. He began challenging his peers, gently but firmly, calling out biases that once would have gone unchecked. Some officers rolled their eyes, dismissing him as soft, but others listened, intrigued by the changes they saw in him. His transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without resistance. But Roberts was committed, no matter how difficult the journey might be. One day, during a routine patrol, Roberts encountered a situation that tested his newfound commitment. He was called to respond to a report of a suspicious person near a convenience store in a part of town that had seen its share of racial tension. When he arrived, he saw a young black man standing outside the store, casually leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets. In the past, Roberts would have immediately approached him with suspicion, assuming he was up to no good. But today, he took a moment to observe the situation, to approach with an open mind. As he walked up to the young man, he smiled and nodded in greeting. "Afternoon, how's it going?" he asked, his tone friendly and genuine. The young man looked at him, surprised by the approach, and nodded cautiously. "Good, officer, just waiting for a friend," he replied, his voice careful but polite. Roberts could sense the young man's wariness, a guardedness that came from experience. He knew that look all too well, the same look Mr. Johnson had given him, the look of someone who had been judged unfairly too many times. Instead of questioning him further, Roberts took a different approach. "You local here?" he asked, striking up a casual conversation. The young man hesitated, clearly unsure of the officer's intentions, but eventually nodded. "Yeah, been here all my life," he replied, still cautious. Roberts smiled, keeping his tone light. "Good to know. I'm just here to make sure everyone's safe, but you don't look like you're causing any trouble." There was a pause, and then the young man's guarded expression softened slightly, as if he were realizing that this encounter was going to be different from others he had experienced. As they continued to talk, Roberts learned that the young man named Jamal was a student at a nearby community college, studying to become a social worker. They spoke briefly about his studies, his aspirations, and the challenges he faced. Roberts listened intently, genuinely interested, and he felt a pang of regret as he realized how many young men like Jamal he had misjudged in the past. This simple conversation was a reminder of the importance of seeing people as individuals, of looking beyond assumptions and stereotypes. Before he left, Roberts extended his hand, and Jamal shook it, albeit with some surprise. "Thanks for chatting with me, officer," Jamal said, a hint of gratitude in his voice. Roberts smiled, nodding. "Anytime. You stay safe, all right," he replied, feeling a sense of satisfaction as he walked away. It was a small interaction, a brief encounter, but it meant more to him than any arrest or bust he had made in his years on the force. He knew that he had just taken another step toward becoming the man he wanted to be, a man worthy of the badge he wore. Over the next few days, Roberts continued to reflect on his encounter with Mr. Johnson. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being called to something greater, that he had a responsibility to use his position to make a difference. He began to read articles, watch documentaries, and educate himself on the history of racial profiling, of the systemic injustices that had plagued communities for generations. It was painful, eye-opening work, but he felt a deep need to understand, to see the world through the eyes of those who had suffered at the hands of people like him. One evening, as he prepared to leave an event at the community center, he saw Mr. Johnson standing by the door, watching him with a quiet smile. Roberts approached him, feeling a sense of gratitude and respect that words could hardly express. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice filled with sincerity, "I just wanted to thank you for giving me that chance, for believing that I could change." Mr. Johnson nodded, his expression warm. "Officer Roberts, change is never easy, but it's always possible. I didn't give you that chance. You gave it to yourself by choosing to walk this path." They stood in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. Roberts realized that this was just the beginning of his journey, that he would continue to face challenges, to confront his own biases, and to work toward becoming a better man, a better officer. But he also knew that he was no longer walking that path alone. He had the support of the community, the guidance of people like Mr. Johnson, and a renewed commitment to justice and compassion. As he walked to his car that night, Roberts looked up at the sky, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He knew that he would still make mistakes, that he would still have to face his own flaws. But he was no longer afraid to confront them. He had learned that true strength wasn't about power or authority. It was about humility, about the willingness to listen and to grow. He had learned that respect was earned, not demanded, and that every person he encountered had a story worth hearing. The next day, Roberts returned to his precinct, ready to start his shift with a renewed sense of purpose. He no longer saw his badge as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of his duty to serve, to protect, and to uplift the community he had once viewed with suspicion. He greeted his colleagues with a nod, walking past the locker room with a quiet confidence that came from within. He knew that his journey was just beginning, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead. As he stepped outside, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift from his shoulders. The city stretched out before him, vibrant and alive, filled with people from all walks of life, each with their own story, their own struggles, and their own dreams. And for the first time, he saw them clearly, not as strangers or as threats, but as individuals worthy of respect and understanding. He knew that he had a long road ahead, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. With that, he climbed into his patrol car, turned on the engine, and drove off into the heart of the city, ready to serve with honor, with humility, and with a newfound commitment to justice.